Gentlemen, today is September the 22nd, 2024. We are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How you doing?
Pretty good. It's been a while since we talked.
Has it?
No. I wanted to make a joke because this is the quickest turnaround we've had back-to-back collaboration. Got him.
Yeah. Yeah, we did actually play Baldur's Gate, right? I didn't just dream that.
I know it was late for you, and thank you for staying up to play some of that with me.
No, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed it. I was just a little more tired than usual because I've been going to bed earlier the past week.
Yeah. It's fun to see how the different campaigns play out based on the party loadout. Like, the fights go pretty different depending on which classes you bring. So the classes that we have are very different from what I have in my solo run. So with the encounters fresh, it's kind of like I want to see what they're like with the stuff that we're bringing. And how we position differently based on what we have. And we have a lot more minions with Lae'zel being a spore druid. So we've got a lot more buffer on the field that I don't have. My other run is like 4 super high DPS glass cannons. Is kind of the loadout. I have no tanky hero per se, aside from I guess Vengeance Paladin. So Minthar is probably the tankiest character that can just be in the frontline area and apply buffs to people in blind key targets.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's fun. I'm down to do more this evening if you want to.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I just felt bad because the last couple of weeks we did it for like 20 minutes, but that's because the world discussions was so lit that we filled a bunch of time, and that's good. And I heard that this was a relatively spicy week.
Well, there was one event in particular. So, yeah, we'll definitely get to that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've heard of it by now.
Yes, I believe it will be the walkie-talkie story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually heard about this from my dad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I hadn't browsed news for that day or whenever, and I just randomly wanted to check in on him. And we were catching up and stuff, and I mentioned our segments being on Sundays and stuff, and just how it's interesting what of the world events social media tends to focus on, which means the people in your social group end up being opinionated on stuff regarding specific countries that you've maybe never been to, just because the stuff that you browse is telling you to see the issue this way and interact and lobby in this way.
Yeah.
And he browses more conservative stuff than me for sure, and it's all good. We were able to have a good conversation, but from what I understood, it was a Israeli attack effort where, because Hamas didn't want to use smartphones, they wanted to be less detectable in that sense, they got a bunch of walkie-talkies instead, which is an older tech, but these were specifically rigged to be able to be detonated. So that's about all I know, but there was damage to those key officials, whoever had access to those items, and then maybe some collateral damage as well, but I didn't see any numbers.
Yeah, well, I've definitely got some numbers for you. Yeah, you've got the basics down, but there's a couple details. It wasn't just walkie-talkies; it was actually also pagers.
Were there any Blackberries as well?
I don't think so. These were like old school pagers.
Huh.
These were apparently they were knockoffs. You know, we'll kind of get into that, but yeah, like you say, they wanted to get away from smartphones and they started using older technology, specifically pagers. The walkie-talkies are just kind of general issue. You know, those are useful pretty much regardless. But yeah, the thousands apparently of Hezbollah's pagers had explosives put into them, as well as the radios, you know, the walkie-talkies, and they were all detonated over the course of the past week. Specifically, on Tuesday, it was the pagers that were detonated. And there were 12 deaths and a couple thousand injured. And then on Wednesday, they detonated the walkie-talkies. In that case, there was much fewer wounded, only about 450, but there were actually twice as many deaths, about 25. That's apparently because the radios are bigger, and so they could contain more explosives, so they tended to be more lethal.
And these were also completely functional walkie-talkies as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. Both the
Huh.
pagers and the two-way radios were fully functional, and they'd already been using them for a while.
Damn. And they just blew all of each type up at the same time? I guess that would make the most sense, so they can't figure out what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened. There's
Damn.
actually footage of the city of Beirut where you can see smoke from different explosions that all happened at the same time in different areas of the city. So it was quite destructive. Israel hasn't taken credit for it, but everybody knows.
Who else would it be?
They're not fooling anybody. So a couple of notes on this. So what they did with the pagers is Israel, or more specifically their intelligence agency, probably the Mossad, somehow hacked into the network through which messages are distributed to the recipients of, or to the holders of the pagers, and they faked a message from Hezbollah's leadership. And so what they did then is, because people got the message, they picked up the pager and then they were looking at it to see what the message was. And that's when they set them off. So they tried to set it up so there was maximum likelihood of damage to the person holding the pager. Ideally, the pager would go off while they were holding it in their hand close to their face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's not where you want a bomb to be.
Yeah. Yeah, they were smart about it, and they were pretty successful. There was a doctor in Lebanon who did an interview with the BBC, and he was saying that he had had to extract more damaged eyeballs than he ever had previously over the course of his entire career. Apparently, medical professionals in Lebanon have also had to amputate a number of hands because, of course, people holding the pagers or the radios suffered extensive damage when the devices exploded in their hands.
And who was the sale of these to? Was it like, did they know it's going to specific people or just to the organization as a whole?
General organization.
Okay.
It's not even clear if they managed to injure or kill any senior members with this. It seems to be just more of a general attack on the command and control network of Hezbollah.
Huh.
Yeah, I've got some notes on some of the reasoning here for that too, but just real quick, I want to get through some of the details about what actually happened. Yes, the healthcare system, lots of people badly injured. It's been very ugly. A number of civilians were injured because often people with the pagers or the radios were just kind of out in public when they went off, so there was some collateral damage there. Okay, so as far as why Israel did this, that's a little more ambiguous. I mean, the initial assumption was just that they wanted to strike a blow against Hezbollah, because anybody who's been following, the Gaza conflict knows that Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel since the conflict in Gaza started, nominally out of solidarity with Israel. But if you've been paying more attention to it, or if you've been listening to us talk about it, you also know that neither Israel or Hezbollah is actually that interested in escalating the conflict. A lot of the violence on the border, in so much as it's related to Gaza, is largely just superficial posturing by Hezbollah. They don't actually want to fight a war. And Israel, for its part, is more focused on Gaza, so they don't really want to fight a war either, although that's starting to change, and I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, so the idea, what happened allegedly, according to, I think, Axios and Al Monitor, which are two news outlets that have more coverage over the Middle East, what they said, according to some of their sources in Israel, is that they weren't, that is to say, the Israeli government wasn't necessarily going out of their way to do this as a part of their operations against Hezbollah, because of course when Hezbollah fires rockets, the IDF retaliates. So there's been a lot of tit for tat, since the Gaza conflict started. So what they reported, again, Al Monitor and Axios, is that actually there was a fear in the Israeli government, and again, specifically the intelligence agency, that Hezbollah was apparently about to find out about the vulnerability and that they were about to then lose the capability. And so rather than just give that up for nothing, they decided to pull the trigger. So this isn't necessarily a part of, well, I mean, it is part of the tit for tat between Hezbollah and Israel that's been going on. I think if relations were so much better, or at least if things were quiet on the northern border, the Israeli government might not have done this and they would have just let it go. But because there's so much tension right now, instead of just letting Hezbollah find out about it and then deal with it, they decided to go out of their way to needle them by detonating all of these explosives at the same time. So in a sense, you can think of that as being the equivalent of an Israeli airstrike targeting Hezbollah rockets or Hezbollah senior leadership, as they've been doing basically for months now, as part of this tit for tat with Hezbollah. So that's not necessarily new. What's new here is just the method. It's just kind of a weird thing, a weird way to do it. But again, it doesn't seem like, if the reporting is accurate, that this is something they went out of their way to do. It's just something they decided to do because they thought they wouldn't be able to do it, because they thought Hezbollah was kind of catching on to the fact that the explosives were there and that they had this vulnerability.
And where was the strike exactly? You said Beirut?
You mean the explosives?
Yes.
They were all over Lebanon. Just Beirut is the largest city, so they tend to have more people, more Hezbollah members there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, southern Lebanon, other parts of Lebanon, just wherever any member of Hezbollah was who had one of these pagers. And again, largely it was more rank and file members.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of handed them out. So yeah, it's certainly inconvenient, to have a lot of your guys just kind of get randomly blown up.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, this really doesn't change the strategic balance of power much. I mean, really not at all. Again, this is largely just a retaliatory move by Israel in response to Hezbollah rocket attacks. And so it's more about just mild punishment in an attempt to establish deterrence than it is about trying to fully stop Hezbollah. Because if Israel really wanted to crack down on Hezbollah, they could. They just haven't really been doing it. Instead, they've been doing relatively minor tit-for-tat stuff. Now,
if they crack down, what would that mean? Like a full-scale military operation?
They could do a full-scale invasion. They could do a land invasion of southern Lebanon. They've done it before. Keep in mind that Israel occupied southern Lebanon for something like 20 years, from the 1980s into the mid-late 1990s. That's actually basically how Hezbollah came to exist. They were originally a resistance organization in southern Lebanon that was fighting against the Israeli occupation there. So that is on the table. It would probably be harder than it was before. Hezbollah is much more well-armed than it was back in the 80s or 90s. And they would probably be receiving a lot more assistance, from foreigners than they did back then. Not the least of which would be Iranian support. But yeah, that's what it would look like. Certainly they could go much harder. If they don't want to do a land invasion, they could go much harder in terms of like airstrikes, assassinations, etc. Obviously Israel's intelligence agency is immensely capable. So, there's a lot more that they could do, but right now they prefer relatively mild tit-for-tat retaliation so that they can focus more on Gaza. And I think part of that, too, is recognition that Hezbollah itself isn't really interested in a full conflict. Again, violence in the Middle East is often more symbolic and political in nature rather than actually, having an objective of, purposeful, let's say. It's not generally all that purposeful. It doesn't have like an objective it seeks to achieve beyond just superficial political posturing. So that's not unusual. But the calculus could change because one of the things that happened over the past couple weeks is that in Israel, there's been more and more pressure to try to end the war. People blame Netanyahu. That doesn't mean people want to go easier on the Palestinians, just that they think Netanyahu could end the conflict successfully, could have ended it successfully much earlier if you were actually serious about it. So goes the criticism. And one of the main points of criticism against Netanyahu is also that he's not going hard enough on Hezbollah, with the result that the thousands of people in northern Israel who have been displaced from their homes because of Hezbollah rocket attacks have not been able to go back for months. So there's, I think, 10, 20,000 people, whatever it is, in northern Israel who had to be evacuated because of the rocket attacks. And they've just kind of been cooling it in refugee camps of one kind or another, or other accommodations since then, unable to return to their homes. And there's more and more criticism both from them and from general society about that status quo. So the Israeli government is feeling the pressure, and the Netanyahu administration is increasingly pushing Hezbollah to try to reach some kind of accommodation where the rocket attacks could either end or could start being scaled down so that people in northern Israel could return home. So that's created a new incentive for the Israeli government to go harder on Hezbollah, and I think that's part of the reason why there have been more airstrikes in Lebanon by the IDF, and also probably it was part of the reasoning behind detonating the devices. Again, they had a judgment call, like, we're about to lose the capability, do we do it or no? And I think they ultimately decided to do so in part because they wanted to just generically apply pressure to Hezbollah, just to kind of send a message. Another thing that came out of Axios and Al Monitor was that the original plan, allegedly, for the devices was to use them at the start of an actual war between Israel and Hezbollah, the idea being to disrupt their command and control networks at the beginning of the conflict to make their military less capable in the early stages of said conflict. That makes a lot more sense to me than this, where they just kind of do it randomly to relatively little effect. Again, this isn't really going to change anything in the long term or even medium term. And the short-term impact is going to be relatively mild as well. It's not going to surprise anybody in Hezbollah that Mossad has infiltrated them or their supply chains and whatnot. In fact, one of the things I was reading is that this is apparently normal activity. Like, Hezbollah knows that the Israelis are trying to infiltrate their supply chains for their equipment and regularly check their equipment and supply chains to ensure that they're secure. And they've apparently foiled other Israeli attempts to do stuff like this. The issue here is that they overlooked these particular vulnerabilities, the radios and the pagers. And there was even a Hezbollah guy talking to a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor who says, they tricked us, hats off to the enemy, So this is not unexpected. Obviously, Hezbollah doesn't like it, but believe it or not, this is basically just normal behavior for Israel and Hezbollah. Like, both of them know that they're doing these kinds of things, and so in this case, one of the Israeli attempts, well, two of them, I guess, happened to be successful, and Hezbollah is hurting now on account of it. But like I was mentioning, it makes more sense to do it at the beginning of an actual war, where the short-term benefit is, more useful than right now. Because again, I think it's being done here just more for tit-for-tat retaliation, and the utility there, especially given the extent and uniqueness of the penetration that the Israeli intelligence agency made, kind of wastes it a little bit. It doesn't make as much sense here. So the explanation that they just decided to do it because they thought Hezbollah was about to learn about the vulnerability and deal with it, that makes more sense to me. So the follow-up has been more Israeli airstrikes and more rocket attacks in retaliation from Hezbollah. They've kind of been escalating a bit. The Israelis have been more aggressive recently in the past few days about their airstrikes. They've been targeting more senior leadership, and in particular, on Saturday, they targeted senior members of Hezbollah's Special Forces unit, the Radwan. So they've been going a bit harder, and Hezbollah has been going a bit harder in return. And again, I think the logic there is not out of control tit for tat. I think in this case, it's more the Israeli government responding to the increased political pressure over the displaced residents in northern Israel. I don't know if Israel, specifically the Israeli government, is going to be willing to go to the mat for that, however much pressure there is. From what I've read, the Netanyahu administration, and specifically Netanyahu himself, is actually pretty risk-averse when it comes to outright conflict. So while he might be willing to intimidate Hezbollah and tick up the intensity of the violence against Hezbollah, it may be that when it comes to the precipice, he's going to sort of withdraw. I don't think it's entirely clear that they're going to actually go to war over this. But clearly there's pressure, hence the violence. And it could be that events are getting away from both Hezbollah and the Israeli government, because they can't really control each other's behavior. They can signal to each other all they want about not wanting to escalate further. In fact, the head of Hezbollah already did that. He said something to the effect of, we're going to get you back for this, but we're not going to escalate. We don't want further violence. So, that's all good and well. That's normal. We've talked before about, symbolic posturing and how violence is used in that. But at the same time, if this continues, it could spin out. It could reach a degree where both sides miscalculate and they end up in a general conflict, whether they want it or not. Let's see. So I had some details about the operation that the Israeli intelligence agency engaged in here. Obviously, we don't have all the details about how the Mossad infiltrated the supply chain for the pagers and the two-way radios. But some early investigative attempts by journalists have revealed some details. So as far as the pagers, apparently Israeli agents set up some kind of fake company in Hungary called BAC Consulting. And they apparently, that is to say, BAC Consulting, tried to buy pagers from a Taiwan manufacturer called Gold Apollo. And it's not clear if that went through or if the negotiations were protracted and never went anywhere. But what happened is that about a year later, after they started trying to buy the pagers, they gave up on that and instead actually bought the right to produce their own pagers using Gold Apollo's trademark. Now, from there, so it's not clear if they then went and manufactured their own pagers and then sold them on to Hezbollah, or if they just bought a bunch of pagers, maybe knockoffs even, or maybe the legitimate article, and then slapped the Gold Apollo trademark on them and then resold those onto Hezbollah. But regardless, Hezbollah fell for it. Whoever it is responsible for procuring equipment thought they were a legitimate company and ended up going with them, maybe because they were relatively cheap. Who knows? And apparently these pagers are relatively new. There was a guy working for Hezbollah. A Lebanese security official told Reuters that about 5,000 pagers had been brought into Lebanon about 5 months ago. So these are not pagers who have been around and have been in use for several years. These are pagers that were brought in within the past 6 months. So this is a relatively recent vulnerability that the Israelis were able to create and exploit. Now that's the pagers. As for the two-way radios, it's not really clear what kind of Israeli front company was responsible for this, or if they even had one, or if it was the same one that they used for the pagers. Whoever contracted with Hezbollah here either bought or manufactured potentially knockoff versions of a Japanese two-way radio that had been originally manufactured by ICOM, but which had been out of manufacturing for something like 10, 15 years. And ICOM says, for their part, that they didn't know anything about it, and that there's a whole bunch of knockoffs of their product available for sale online. Which apparently, the journalist involved investigated that, and that's apparently true. So there's a whole bunch of knockoffs that somebody could have easily bought, rebranded, placed explosives in, and then sold on to Hezbollah. So that's about the extent of what's known about the background here. And again, Hezbollah knew kind of that the Israeli government has been trying to infiltrate, their suppliers, and they'd been pretty decent about preventing that. But obviously, in this case, there were two failures on their part that the Israelis were able to exploit. So again, there's not actually much new here. Obviously, it's kind of a coup in terms of intelligence for the Israeli government, but the long-term implications are pretty minor. And I don't think there's really any implications for the broader economy, like for global trade or confidence in manufacturers overseas, because most companies are not buying like cheap knockoffs. If you're buying top-of-the-line stuff, you're probably buying it from manufacturers or from middlemen who have decent reputations. You're not going to be going out and just buying from the lowest bidder, on some shady marketplace, or from peddlers, as it were. who don't have any established record or reputation, like a lot of these front companies the Israeli setup seem to have, or not to have, rather. So, I don't think there's going to be many consequences there, other than people who do buy, from third-party sellers or relatively unknown companies, maybe being more cautious. But I think those people kind of already knew it was a relatively risky market they were in, so they're probably already hedging.
Yeah, pretty clever play. Has there ever been any similar communication sabotage like that in the past?
I don't think of that scale, because it was several thousand devices that were detonated all at the same time here on Tuesday and then again on Wednesday in Lebanon. So I don't think I've ever heard of anything that big.
Were the walkie-talkies and the pagers from the same seller?
Unclear. Yeah, it's not clear if Hezbollah got them both from the same supplier or if it was separate suppliers.
Because I would think that if you had a certain brand of them or you got them from a certain person and all of those blew up, you might want to assess the stock of those items.
Yeah, I'm sure Hezbollah is doing that for sure. Yeah, I'm sure they're picking through all their stuff and double checking everything and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, they were already doing that. Sometimes you just miss something, or maybe there's corruption, or maybe Mossad bribed somebody. There's plenty of that as well. There's any number of ways it could have happened. I guess my underlining point here is that as exciting and weird as the story was, it doesn't really augur any broader significant changes in either the conflict or in global trade.
It was a unique and effective jab, but not one that changes the landscape.
Yeah.
Definitely one that makes them paranoid.
Well, they're already quite paranoid. Anybody who's been fighting with the Israelis for the better part of half a century knows it pays to be paranoid. This is hardly unusual behavior for the Israelis. So all of their enemies are well aware of that and take precautions. It's just sometimes those precautions are not enough.
Chai was asking about the functionality of Lebanon as a state. Can Lebanon defend against Israel? How would that work?
Short answer, no. The most powerful military in Lebanon is not the Lebanese military. It's actually Hezbollah. Hezbollah is easily more powerful than the Lebanese army.
Interesting.
Yeah. They receive a lot more in aid from Iran and probably from other sources. They have a much stronger ground game in southern Lebanon, which is sort of the core of their support. Generate a lot of revenue from de facto taxation as well as donations to, the cause, quote unquote. And they also have a lot of political influence in Lebanese politics proper, because, of course, as a major political faction with their own political party, as well as alliances with other smaller factions and parties in Lebanon, they have a strong presence in the legislature that they can use to prevent the Lebanese government from taking strong action against them. Certainly, they can prevent the government from cracking down on their militia. Not that the army would be able to do anything, even if the government tried to do that, but really they can't even get to that stage, because Hezbollah's political actors in the legislature, as well as in the executive, will generally block any effort to do so.
How long has Hezbollah lived there? Because that's like, you're not the biggest military in your country because another one exists there. Did they get the rights to be there and then just expand a bunch, or?
Oh, no, it's not, as far as I know, legal.
Okay.
Hezbollah really came out of the Lebanese civil war. I don't know how familiar you are with that.
No. When was it?
Okay. So the Lebanese civil war started in the mid-1970s. It started for different reasons that are kind of complex, but the short version is that the Christian community in Lebanon, which had been the demographic majority, started over the course of the mid-20th century to become a minority. In other words, the Muslim population came to be larger. And that got to be a problem because Lebanon was basically created by the French government in the wake of World War I. Because keep in mind, Lebanon and Syria were both League of Nations mandate territories that were given to France to govern. And one of the things they did was carve out Lebanon from that mandate territory and basically make it a Christian state. And the Christians therein were generally the political elites and the economic elites. But as the demographics changed, there was more and more communal tension between the two groups. And there's actually really three groups. It's the Sunni Muslims, the Christians, and then the Druze. I think we've talked about them before. They're sort of that funky Islamic sect that was founded a couple hundred years ago by the guy who thought he was God and got his people. He was an elite, so he owned a big estate, so he got people in his local area to start worshiping him, basically. So kind of like Muslim Mormons in a sense. Kind of think of them like that. So they're a distinctive group, and they formed kind of a third faction in the war. So these different communal groups, basically tension between them grew over the course of the 60s and 70s, and it finally exploded in a general conflict. There had been an understanding before that about the allocation of political power within the government, but all of those norms and agreements fell apart, and that's basically why the fighting started. So Lebanon was absolutely torn apart by the Lebanese Civil War. It was very violent, gruesome. Everybody and their mother formed a militia and fought to protect their territory, even if they weren't necessarily being aggressive and trying to actually expand and take territory. You still had to form a militia just to defend yourself against all the other militias that were doing that. So everybody was armed. Everybody had to be ready for violence. There was lots of car bombings, lots of assassinations. Long story short, a very ugly period of Lebanon's history. And it got worse because a bunch of foreign countries got involved, unsurprisingly. So one of the things that happened before the Civil War is that Lebanon, like a number of countries in the region, hosted Palestinian refugees. And in the case of Lebanon, they actually hosted the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was an organization that was formed to fight for the Palestinian people. It was partly formed by Palestinians themselves, but there was also input and participation by various governments in the region that were anti-Israel. It's a whole, the PLO is a whole conversation unto itself, but the PLO was de facto based out of Lebanon in the 60s and 70s. And they were, of course, in that time engaging in intermittent acts of terrorism against Israel, as well as against either Israeli or Jewish targets overseas. Now, the Israelis, for their part, didn't like that. They didn't really feel like they could just invade Lebanon. They did try to assassinate PLO leaders. They did engage in operations there. But it wasn't until the Civil War started that the Israeli military was actually sent in. And like I mentioned before, when they went in, they basically occupied the entire southern chunk of Lebanon. And that was where, the PLO was. And what the Israelis did is that they allied with various factions in the Civil War that were opposed to the PLO. Because, again, the demographics of Lebanon were changing. The Muslims were becoming the majority. One of the factors in that demographic shift was the influx of Palestinian refugees. Because while there weren't necessarily a whole lot of them, it was enough to kind of tilt the balance. They were sort of the difference maker. And so as a result, they were in particular unpopular. To a degree, they're unpopular to this day for that reasons. There's lots of people in Lebanon that still kind of blame them for the Civil War and for the occupation by the Israelis. So there were plenty of basically militias that the Israelis found, I think in particular Christian militias that were eager to fight, the PLO. And so that's how things kind of panned out. The Israelis moved in, I want to say in the early 1980s, occupied southern Lebanon, and then fought against the PLO, specifically against PLO irregulars like guerrilla fighters. And then the Israelis supported, I think, Christian militias, specifically the Phalange is the one I remember, to try to help them, fight and defeat the PLO wherever they could be found. There was one particular famous case of a massacre where Phalange militia killed, I think, something like 1,000 Palestinians in one go. And the Israeli government kind of knew about it. They just didn't do anything about it, and may have been partly culpable as well. I don't remember the name of the massacre.
Sabra and Shatila?
Sorry, what?
Chat saying Sabra and Shatila massacre.
I would defer to Chad on that. I do remember that there was a movie made about the invasion of southern Lebanon, and they did kind of portray some of those events. Yeah, Waltz with Bashir, the movie was called. It's actually really good. Strong recommend there. You can kind of think of the whole experience, the Israeli experience in southern Lebanon, as being something akin to Israel's Vietnam. You know, it was a it was a 20-some year long counterinsurgency campaign that ultimately just didn't go anywhere. And eventually a center-left government came to power that just withdrew completely.
Sounds like full Mad Max over there. Sheesh.
Well, yeah, the Lebanese civil war was definitely very violent. But actually, I didn't answer the fully question. So the question was where the origins of Hezbollah. Yeah, so Israel was occupying southern Lebanon. They were fighting the PLO and helping rivals of the PLO fight them as well. Some of the Sunni militias in southern Lebanon, which were, of course, fighting, you know, the Christians and the Druze, didn't like that Israel was there, basically fighting with their enemies, and so they themselves turned on the Israeli occupiers. And one of the main groups that was formed was Hezbollah. So, you know, the reason that Hezbollah and its militia exists and continues to exist is not because it was ever legalized. It's basically just a holdover from the Lebanese civil war. And they were too politically powerful once the war ended for the government to just, you know, dismantle. Hezbollah basically predicated participation in the post-war peace on their being able to continue to maintain their militia in the field. And that was a precondition a number of other groups had as well. You know, again, the government is just a nominal power in Lebanon. The real power really lays with the political parties that represent the different sectarian groups.
Interesting. Yeah, some of the countries like Ukraine is also an example, having major changes that happened within the last few decades, as opposed to like kingdoms that have existed for thousands of years, like India and China. It's a pretty different landscape of how fresh the conflicts are and how powerful the state is as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, Lebanon definitely has a very weak state. And unfortunately, their political culture hasn't been really able to evolve beyond the communal mindset. You know, there's a sense that the different communal groups have to be represented by a particular leader or party, and that those parties need to negotiate with each other on the assumption that they need to share power in government between each other. And the result has been a large degree of state capture, where the parties themselves are very corrupt and basically just free ride on their status as the official, quote unquote, representatives of this, that, or the other sectarian community. You know, they're supposed to represent their legitimate interests. Instead, they just run the parties like a mafia for the interests of the party leadership instead of the community. Nobody much likes them, but it's been very hard to get away from them because they have such a stranglehold on political power in Lebanon. I'm reminded of this happened like 10 years ago. It's been a long time, but what happened is that there was a dispute between garbage collectors and the government. And so the garbage collectors went on strike. And the issue is that the garbage collectors were all basically members of one party, of one particular sectarian group. And so the dispute took on a sectarian tone, right? It wasn't just like a normal labor dispute. The money that went to those people partly also then was passed on to the party. And so you can think of it as basically a racket, right? The party is getting money de facto from garbage collection as a public service. And so while it was nominally labor dispute, really it was dispute between parties about how much money would go via the garbage men to that party. And so as a result, after the dispute was protracted and went on for a long time, resulting in garbage just piling up in the street, there were people that came out and started trying to deal with it themselves. Like regular citizens started trying to form groups to get rid of the garbage and circumvent the government entirely. The trouble is that, you know, if you're a mafia guy, that means you're not making money. Like those people are cutting into your trade, and that's not acceptable. So they actually sent goons after these people, right? Party apparatchiks actually dispatched gunmen and other like forms of muscle to stop individual citizens from getting rid of their garbage. So that's
Wow.
like the extent of corruption that we're talking about, right? It's all about the money. Like it's not about the communities, it's not about communal rivalry, it's just all about the money and which party, as controlled by which mafioso, gets how much of the government's budget. And again, that dysfunction just came out of the Civil War. It was like every man for himself, pretty much, or at least every militia for itself. And the result was a lot of self-interested actors. There was not that much interest among the various elites in actually making Lebanon succeed, like as a country, as a unified community. Right? They're all still kind of in a way fighting the war, just economically instead of with violence. So that makes it very easy for Hezbollah to maintain their militia. There's like nobody to stop them. They're too big and powerful in their own right. They effectively have their own little fiefdom down there in southern Lebanon.
It's interesting. Reminds me of like feudal lords in Japan and stuff. They just control the region. They don't actually have like official mandate from the emperor. But if you have enough muscle, then you do what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, there's broad swaths of the Middle East that are defined by that dynamic. States have been struggling mightily to maintain their stability in the face of what are frequently very strong militias supported by foreign actors. Hezbollah, for example, receives a lot of support from Iran, and the Iranians, for their part, also support militias in places like Syria and Iraq in order to exert influence in those countries, generally very successfully. Yeah, you could actually draw a very colorful map of the Middle East if you broke down the countries into the geographies of those countries that are controlled by individual militias or other such groups rather than just by the government. Certainly, you're going to get a lot more polities than you would just looking at a normal map.
We could do that at some point. Do like a Middle East map, and then you draw the military actors or whatever forces control the different zones that aren't the actual like national boundaries.
I think we've done that before.
I think we did the whole world. I can't remember the criteria for it.
It's been a while.
Infestor, thank you for the raid. Welcome.
And you've got me curious. I must have made one at some point to that effect. Let's see. List.
It might also be in our
Hmm?
Discord DMs too. We've done a few of them.
Oh, yeah, that's right. No, you know what? I made one for Mass Neotech a long time ago. That's what it was. Let me see if I can find that.
I have a map, but I don't know what it is. But I bet as soon as you see it, you'll be able to tell me what it is. Do you have the stream up?
I don't have the stream up.
Okay. I will paste it to you again, and I will show the stream. And you can try to guess at what that is. That's funny.
Let's see. Okay, where is this? Neurozerg.
Yeah.
Oh, hotspots. Yeah, those were countries with either wars or failed states.
These ones.
Yeah, Afghanistan probably should not be on there. Would not be on there if I had to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even Syria. I don't know how much fighting still really goes on there. It's kind of settled into more of a frozen conflict, although it's a frozen conflict on the hotter side of things.
Mm-hmm. Are there any ones that aren't lit up here that would be lit up now?
Not really. I don't think there's been a whole lot of new conflicts.
That's good. Take the fill tool and paint Russia red. This is failed or contested states, yes.
Yeah, Russia should be red. Well, I'm not seeing it. I guess I could just make it again. Definitely made one at some point.
Don't worry, we might have 2 new conflicts in East Asia if the dice rolls badly. Which 2?
I'm guessing they're talking about the South China Sea and Taiwan. I don't think that's likely to get fired up, though. The party in China is way more interested in their economy right now. That's their main focus. They want to try to get as self-sufficient as possible in order to hedge against the possibility of another major escalation in the trade war with the United States. Also, they're dealing with, not social upheaval, that's too strong, but, because the economy is kind of dragging ass right now in China, there's relatively more people that are struggling to get by, and that's got the party a little bit worried. So I don't think they're all that interested in rolling the dice as far as like a major military confrontation.
Yeah.
As we've talked about before, the party has its hands full just dealing with 1 point whatever billion Chinese people. That takes up a lot of administrative capacity. Doesn't really leave a lot of extra room for big foreign misadventures. I think one of the mistakes people in the West make is just kind of thinking of China as like another European country. There's a kind of a lineage of rivalry between European countries that extends back centuries. And the assumption has been that as a new power arises, that invariably there's frictions with the established power, and that this invariably leads into conflict of some kind. And there's some truth to that historically speaking, but it's a relatively Eurocentric viewpoint, because a lot of the examples of that are rooted more in European rivalry. China doesn't really have the same history, because historically China was like the wealthiest, most urbanized society on Earth for millennia. And everything that was not conquered by China and incorporated into it was basically just barbarian shit that they didn't want. So, being the Middle Kingdom meant that they didn't really have as much expansionism built into their political culture, like, say, in the West or in the Middle East or even in South Asia to a lesser degree. And, while there certainly is concern in China's politics about the West and the United States in particular, the way that they propose to deal with that is not necessarily the way that European powers would think about it, especially European powers back in the 19th century, early 20th century. Back then, everything was about rivalry and survival. And so, gunning up, getting tougher, what have you, that was all just part and parcel of normal diplomatic push and pull. But with the Chinese government right now, their issue is much more about staying away from that. Like, the rest of the world is very violent from their perspective and unstable, and they don't like it, and they would rather just keep it at arm's length. They have everything they need in China, obviously, except for some things like oil and food and whatnot. But beyond that, they don't need to really just go out and conquer the rest of the world to be safe. China itself is huge. Nobody's going to invade China. You could try, but historically, there's not a lot of examples of that succeeding too well, unless you're the Mongols. But of course, the Mongols are the exception. So, it's just not baked into their political culture to just be very aggressive in response to threats. They tend to become rather more insular in response to threats and uncertainty. So that's probably more what they're going to do, I suspect. So, it's good for the United States government to try to hedge more. I think they should have been hedging a lot more against risks in the Sino-American relationship a long time ago. I think that's kind of a consensus now in American politics. But I also think the idea that China is going to become like the main rival in a new Cold War is way exaggerated. I don't think that's the case at all.
What are the odds that the Koreas will fight?
Low. Neither one has an incentive to do it. South Korea cares less and less about reunification, and North Korea only cares about it in so much as it's a legitimization of the government. And the government doesn't even really rely on that much for legitimization. Most of the North Korean government's legitimacy just comes from state violence. Yeah, they pretend to care about reunification in the North because it scares the South. It gives them leverage diplomatically with both Seoul and Washington. But beyond that, they don't really care that much. I think everybody's familiar with North Korea's diplomatic strategy by now. You know, sound crazy, act violent, and then try to get concessions.
Talk shit,
But an
collect
actual
concessions.
war. Sorry, what?
Talk shit, collect concessions.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically it. So an actual war would be very destructive. They wouldn't likely get very many concessions, and whatever concessions they did get would probably not pay for the conflict. So it's much easier just to act crazy rather than actually be crazy in that sense. Okay. Well, what else did we want to get to today?
I don't know if we had questions, but Fuzzy Cord is around.
Let's see. Got me curious about that map. I could make it. I just don't want there to be a bunch of dead air for several minutes at a time.
Oh, it's all good. And thank our sponsors and stuff.
Let's see. I don't think we had any questions.
Oh, someone was asking about situation in France, if there was an update.
There's not really anything new there. I mean, they did actually finally form a government, and it's a center-right government, basically formed between Emmanuel Macron's party and then Les Républicains, which had been the main center-right party until it basically collapsed. That'll be enough for a majority if they get votes from National Rally, which is going to be controversial. And certainly the left coalition, I forget the names for all of these. The main left-wing coalition of parties is upset because they won the most votes, but they're basically being excluded from the government. But we've already talked about this. This is exactly what we talked about before when we were talking about the controversy, when the protests in France basically kicked off a couple weeks ago, specifically over the fact that Macron was signaling that he didn't want to do a deal with the left and was trying instead for a coalition with the Les Républicains. So the fact that they actually did finally form a government is basically just the finalization of that. So I don't really have anything new to say on that. It's basically just what we all expected to happen. You know, the left can protest. You know, I think I said last time that you know, they can try to kick and scream, but they probably won't be able to actually change the outcome here, and that basically ended up being right. So we'll see where French politics goes from here. You know, maybe this de facto pushes politics towards National Rally. I don't think it's doing the left any favors, but you know, that doesn't necessarily mean much. So we'll see where it goes. I have no idea. Anybody who says they know what's going to happen in French politics, if not, you know, politics in the West generally, is lying either to you or to themselves. So I have no true prognostication there. Just have to wait and see, pretty much.
They think they know. There was someone earlier who also said they would love to hear you talk about Colombia.
Colombia. I knew a woman from Colombia when I was in grad school. She was very interesting. She was very short. She kind of had more native features, but very strong personality. She always got a look in her eye when we talked about FARC. She really hated FARC. Apparently, they killed some of her family members some decades ago.
Oh, damn.
I think specifically it was like a famous event. Like they apparently attacked the like the presidential palace or the Supreme Court's palace, something like that. Yeah, did not like them. I accidentally traumatized her. Actually, I accidentally traumatized her by taking her to go see that movie I was telling you about earlier, Waltz with Bashir.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I was in grad school at the time, and I got some of my friends together and said, "Hey, why don't we go see this? It's like it's a really interesting event in history, and I've never seen anything kind of made about it." And we kind of roped her in, and apparently she had no idea what it was about. She heard the title "Waltz with Bashir," and she thought it was actually about like a waltz. So instead, she gets this violent movie about a war that she was not prepared for, like emotionally, because this is like 10 15 years ago, right? So the war was still ongoing with FARC. They hadn't like demobilized yet, or they were still in the process of demobilizing as part of the peace talks. And so that was kind of a raw topic for her. So that was a mistake on my part. I should have been clear what the movie was about instead of just inviting random people. But yeah, Colombia, it's doing a lot better than it was. FARC has mostly demobilized. There's talks with the ELN that are ongoing. The cartels are less powerful than they used to be. So, you don't have like a couple big drug barons basically just running whole regions. There's a lot more tourism into Colombia. The economy is doing better. There's a larger middle class. The government is relatively more well behaved. They actually have a left-wing president right now. So, there's been a lot of good coming out of Colombia over the past 10, 20 years. However, there's, of course, the downside as well, right? So, while there have been peace talks with FARC and there has been demobilization, those negotiations were immensely controversial. Like, lots of people just did not trust FARC to actually honor the agreement. And even after the agreement was implemented, a lot of people did not like the idea of, quote unquote, reintegrating FARC members into society. That itself was very controversial because there was a sense that these people were just violent criminals and that they would never really reform. And that really, if anything, they belonged in jail for everything they'd done during the conflict. So there was a lot of pushback to the peace deal. There was even a referendum on the peace deal that actually failed, forcing the government to kind of go back to the negotiating table and pretend to renegotiate it before ultimately just imposing the peace deal on the public. It didn't fail by a whole lot. It was, very close, but still, that just illustrates how much skepticism there was of peace negotiations with FARC. So, even the regular going public was skeptical, and then even FARC itself, specifically former members of FARC that were trying to reintegrate into society, found it very difficult because a lot of them didn't really have like a lot of normal life skills that people who had not been fighting a guerrilla war in a jungle their whole lives would have. Their skills were a lot different. So they were unprepared. They had trouble finding jobs. And of course, there was some discrimination because as former members of FARC, there were a lot of people that just kind of fucking hated them, which doesn't do anything for your job prospects. I remember an interview with one woman who had been a member of FARC, and she talked about how sometimes she thought about maybe going back to the jungle. Not necessarily because she wanted to go back to fighting, and living that life, but just because there wasn't much alternative. There just wasn't much else going on for her in terms of just job opportunities as well as just regular life. So, there's been a lot of struggle in terms of dealing with that, the aftermath of that conflict. And of course, there are members of FARC that never accepted the deal and actually just stayed in the jungle. And basically, they became de facto drug dealers. The FARC always had kind of a interesting relationship with the drug trade, right? They always said that it was a means to an end, right? It was their way to raise money for the revolution. But over time, it increasingly became the end, right? An end unto itself, so to speak. They increasingly just did it for the sake of continuing to raise money and probably siphoning it to the leadership. So after the peace deal happened, a lot of the more hardline members of FARC ultimately decided, well, fuck it. We reject the leadership, we reject FARC, we're just going to form our own militia. And then they just de facto became drug dealers, where that became their main trade, with occasional extortion and other forms of violence on the side. The ELN was an entirely different organization than FARC that was also engaging in violent militant activity, but it was also much smaller. And so it wasn't as significant. There's been talks with them, too, that have made a lot of progress over the past couple years, but there hasn't been as much traction either. But because it's a smaller group, it hasn't mattered as much. Their violence isn't as noticeable. I think the bigger problem has been the attempt to try to reform the rural areas where the FARC had operated. I think like in southern Colombia and maybe southeastern Colombia is more where the FARC was operating. And it was kind of a free fire zone, right? You know, you had FARC, you had right wing paramilitaries formed by landowners that had some ties to the government, but were also autonomous and also themselves engaged in the drug trade to raise money. And then the government was the third faction that was trying to kind of maintain order and succeeding in fits and starts here and there, but otherwise really struggling to try to contain violence. So it was very violent to live in those sort of frontier territories. And part of the peace talks with FARC were partly focused on trying to sort of rejuvenate these areas. You know, in particular, they wanted to try to give more rights and autonomy to native groups in those areas because they kind of borne the brunt of the violence between FARC and the right-wing paramilitaries and the government. And that didn't really work out too well. You know, in practice, a lot of the local elites, be they right-wing paramilitaries or former members of FARC that rejected the peace deal, they continued to engage in violence that was designed to siphon money to themselves. You know, be it extortion, kidnapping, you know, what have you, all the stuff they'd been doing before, nominally with an ideological excuse, you know, for the revolution or against the revolution. After the peace talks happened, they basically just started doing it to make money. And that actually made it a bit harder, not easier to deal with, because the groups didn't really have any central leadership the government could really talk to. And the native groups in particular came under attack, you know, because they were a potential new power elite emerging in the region that the government was trying to push. And it failed. Like the native leaders that tried to take advantage of the new opportunities for autonomy were increasingly targets of violence, you know, to the point where they were actually being systematically assassinated. And you know, the local natives asked the government to do something about it, and they basically just couldn't. You know, the government was severely limited in their ability to constrain that violence. So while there has been a lot of progress on that front, as far as trying to lower the overall level of violence and have peace agreements with these major institutional rebel groups, progress on the ground has been relatively limited, especially amongst the rank and file people in the most afflicted areas. So that's kind of the downside of the trend towards peace that we've seen. You know, it's a good trend, but it's not as there hasn't been as much progress as the government likes to pretend. You know, there's plenty of people still engaging in violence, and plenty of people at the local area, especially like smaller people who are poorer, who continue to suffer because of it. I think I remember seeing a video recently too that while there's been a lot more tourism, there's also a lot more sex tourism. You know, the main cities of Colombia are no longer like big centers of the drug trade, but that doesn't mean law and order is necessarily that much stronger. And so it's been relatively easy for things like human trafficking and the drug trade to continue to flourish, even if those trades are not as prominent as they used to be. And so because the overall level of peace and order is higher, the influx of tourists means that there's more tourists kind of taking advantage of that lack of law and order and engaging in pretty dubious activities. You know, a lot of the sex tourists are actually interested in children in particular.
Ugh.
That's not necessarily unusual for sex tourist destinations. You know, Thailand kind of has the same problem, but it's a thorny problem to deal with. You know, the government tries to deal with it, but of course, the local economies are often dominated by mafiosos of one kind or another, you know, organized crime elements, and they don't really want crackdowns like that to succeed. So, you know, the crackdowns correspondingly end up being relatively ineffectual. And while they do have a left-wing president now, he hasn't been able to do a whole lot. You know, broad swaths of the country are still very skeptical of left-wing politics in general. And even though they elected a president, the legislature kind of reflects that continued divide. Like, he doesn't have enough votes in the legislature to really get anything big done. So he's kind of been handcuffed by that. And as a result, he hasn't been able to achieve much, and it's created even more political friction than there had been. You know, people were already skeptical of the status quo and the establishment, and now even more so because there's just been a general lack of progress. And of course, Colombia has been afflicted by, you know, inflation, COVID-19, you know, all of the same dramatic bullshit that's been affecting everybody else around the world. You know, that's just added extra pressure, and the government hasn't really been that great, as I understand it, at dealing with that. Hasn't made a great accounting of itself. So overall, it's doing well, but it's still got problems, and it's the kind of problems you would expect in a developing country. I think Colombia is in a better position to deal with them, especially since its economy is doing better and they've got a larger middle class. But they're kind of in that transitional phase where the middle class is growing, but hasn't yet entrenched itself in the broader society to the point where it can be politically influential enough to really define the political culture. Right now it's still the big political parties, big political personalities, and major influential families that are the bigger determinants of political outcomes in Colombia, rather than the political preferences of the middle class and the common people. So until that transition towards a society that is defined more by the middle class than traditional elites is completed, I think they're going to be stuck in this sort of awkward limbo.
I see.
So I'll add in there that I'm not an expert on Colombia. This is just stuff that I've read about Colombia. And I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here because it's almost certainly justified. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and I do enjoy the feedback. So certainly if anybody from Colombia is listening, or somebody who's been to Colombia is listening, please correct anything that I've gotten wrong. These are my impressions. These are things that I've read, but I can't say that I'm like any kind of authority. And I haven't really been keeping track of it over the past year or two, so I don't know like what the newest stuff going on would be.
Also, if you have a perspective from your country, please let us know in the comments or in the Twitch chat. First-hand accounts are really cool. Plus, your news bias is going to be different from our news bias.
Correct. You've got me in Microsoft Paint, Neuro.
You making a map?
Yeah.
Nice. What you making a map of? Or do we need a guess?
You wanted the Middle East, right?
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So we'll do a little of that. I could have sworn I already had one, but I don't know where it is. I've got too many maps. That's my trouble. Keep making the damn things. Impossible to organize all of it. It's gonna be rough. So yeah, not entirely like sexy answers about France and Colombia there. There's not a lot new going on in France, so I just don't have much to add there. Again, the whole forming of the government thing is just the end game of something else we already talked about a couple weeks ago. In Colombia, I just haven't followed as much. Latin America doesn't make the news much because they're not as critical to like world trade, and they don't have a bunch of wars going on. As far as drama goes, Latin America has its share, but it's relatively well-behaved drama compared to, say, Russia invading Ukraine, or any of the wild shit going on in the Middle East. Nobody's like distributing explosive-laden pagers in Latin America, for which I think everyone should be grateful. Well, did we have any other questions? Any other stuff we wanted to get to?
I don't think specifically.
Not specifically. Okay. Is anything besides Baldur's Gate and StarCraft and Dota that you did this week?
I ranked up a lot in Dota. That was pretty nice.
Oh.
There's someone who's been nice enough to give me kind of big picture coaching of how I can close out games myself as a carry and not throw and mess up. It's pretty tricky, but I like the kind of social experiment of trying to steer a bunch of pirates in the right direction.
And this is going to be a colorful map.
What is really going on in the Middle East?
Quite a bit. I was actually thinking about that the other day. Like, how do you explain all of the different rivalries and the different wars going on at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that it was kind of like explaining events in season 10 of like an anime.
Oh,
It's been going on for a long time.
If you haven't seen
Like,
that.
I can explain it, but without all the background from the previous seasons, it's not going to make any sense.
Mm-hmm. True.
We'll try. We'll endeavor to try. Okay, that. Yeah, this is going to be a little rough, so it's not going to be exact, but
it's all good.
it'll get the idea across.
Sounds good to me.
Oh, is there anything you wanted to get to? I guess I already asked that.
No, we chillin'. Chat's amazed that I'm able to play StarCraft and listen to you at the same time. They're like, it's not possible. And it's like, well, I'm not playing at my absolute best ever, but definitely getting
Also,
some games
you've gotten
in.
a lot of practice. How long have we been doing this now?
Like 7 years or something.
Yeah. It's been a hot minute. We've been around the block a few times. Let's see. Do we want to do the Horn of Africa too? Or do we want to leave that out?
Sure, if you would consider it to be a player in kind of what goes down in the Middle East.
Yeah, kind of peripherally. Not as much. More so recently. I think we were talking before about how the Egyptians are deploying some military personnel to Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
And how Somalia is kind of using that as leverage against Ethiopia. So they don't recognize Somaliland. Okay. Roughly, I think this should do. Let's try that. $24. Yeah. Okay, let's try that. And I'll send that to you in Discord.
Cool. Thank you for making a map. I will show you the map, chat, after this game. Any updates on the American election that we should cover?
Not really. Nothing jumps to mind. It only ever gets more insipid. So, yeah, just more of the same dumb shit. I don't even remember off the top of my head what new developments there's been. Just more accusations, basically. Nothing too big. You know, the big stuff won't be until October. I think for now we're kind of in between events.
What are we accusing people of this time?
Oh god, I don't even remember. It was something dumb enough that I didn't bother remembering. What was it? I think Trump was accusing or calling Kamala Harris something or other.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It won't make a difference. It wasn't like a big power play. It was just new additional rhetoric in the traditional Trump style.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Desktop. Yeah, that's the one.
Am I forgetting anything? Don't think so. Yeah, let's just go with that. I guess I could have thrown in Pakistan, but that would have just cluttered it up even more. Let's see, what did I have in my notes? I know there's more stuff that we could get to. Let's see, we did the pager bombs. Oh yeah, there's some stuff on Ukraine. So apparently Indian manufacturers are selling artillery shells to Ukraine, which is a development. Well, maybe not a development, because they've been doing it for a while, apparently, but the allegation is new anyway. Apparently the Russian government has been like warning them to stop for years now. The Indian government is like, it's not happening. We don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, if you study Indian politics, one of the pronounced features of said politics is corruption. So it's not that unusual that there would be big manufacturers that are just sort of evading the law, shall we say. So the Indian government denies the allegations. The Russian government basically knows that they're true, but they can't really force the Indian government to take action, probably because the manufacturers involved are well connected, would be my guess. To be fair, the artillery shells in question are not being sold directly to Ukraine. Apparently, they're being sold to Italian and Czech companies that then re-export them onto Ukraine. It's an interesting example of the re-export trade being used in favor of Ukraine instead of against it. A lot of the time we talk about re-exports, it's talking about how Russia is using them to get around sanctions. Because the stuff that they can't buy directly from the West, they can buy in a third-party country that is not being sanctioned by the West, and then re-export it onto Russia. So in this case, Ukraine is doing something similar with Indian manufacturers.
Who's sanctioning Ukraine? Why do they need to use the Indian manufacturers?
Oh, they don't need to. They just want to, because they want as many artillery shells as possible.
Oh,
they're not being sanctioned per se. They're already getting support from the West, and of course they're manufacturing their own stuff too, but it's not enough. They need more. Like famously, they bought a whole bunch from South Korea in 2023, for example. So any source of artillery shells is useful for their purposes, but India has nominally pretended to be neutral in the conflict and nominally has a ban on exporting to countries in conflicts. And they also have a ban on re-export of their equipment to countries in conflict. But again, rules and regulations in India are kind of fluid in terms of enforcement. So they're not looking too hard to make sure that the people they sell to are actually adhering to those requirements. So it's not about sanctions, it's just about Ukraine taking advantage of some mild Indian hypocrisy.
Just doing business with whoever they can.
Yeah, and it's not a large amount from what I read. It's just a relatively small percentage of the total imports of artillery shells that Ukraine has been importing. So it's not going to make a big difference one way or the other. It's just, again, every shell is useful. So it's a useful amount at the margin. But overall, it's, a very small percentage of the overall artillery shells being used in the conflict. See, so the other news regarding Ukraine was that the Russian government announced that they're going to significantly expand the size of their military, specifically the army. They're apparently going to expand it by 180,000 men. And so the total size of the Russian army will be about 2.38 million people once the newest additions are made, 1.5 million of which will be active servicemen. So that'll make the Russian army the second largest in the world when it's complete, second only to China. And they're going to leapfrog, what was it, the United States and India in the rankings by doing this. So pretty significant expansion here. It'll put pressure on the Ukrainians because, of course, they'll have difficulty matching that. They're already having difficulty just replacing the losses that they're experiencing right now. So 180,000 could potentially be a game changer for the conflict, depending on what they're used for. It's not clear to me necessarily that these are all, that is to say, all 180,000 of these new people that are going to be brought into the army are going to be sent to the front. They could be brought in for secondary roles, or maybe just to fill gaps in the front, or be garrison units in order to contain any potential future excursion by the Ukrainian army into Russia, like what we've seen in Kursk. Yeah, keep in mind that while the Russian economy has been relatively robust, the war is still very expensive. And we're kind of reaching a point of diminishing returns as far as the Russian government's ability to continue to mobilize resources. The last time there was a big mobilization, it took the Russian government the better part of a year to fully gather people, bring them into the army, equip them, train them, and then actually get them into the field. That's not to say it took them a whole year to do all of that in that specific order. It just took them a full year to do all of that for the total amount of people that they wanted to mobilize. It was like 100,000 or 200,000 people in the last mobilization. And they were able to get individual people that were mobilized through that process and to the front relatively quickly. The issue was actually getting 200,000 people total. Doing that took them the better part of a year because it takes the Russian government a long time to do pretty much anything. So I don't think it'll be much different this time. I suspect by the time they have actually added 180,000 additional people to the army, it'll probably be the middle or so of 2025. So they're not actually going to see the benefit of this for a while, I expect. And the other big question here is whether or not they can actually equip all of these people. One of the problems in the last mobilization, and to a lesser degree since then, has been ensuring that all of the infantrymen on the front, as well as other parts of the army, are fully equipped. That's been logistics has been a running problem both in this war as well as in other Russian wars over the course of the country's history. So depending on the state of the Russian economy and the Russian government's administrative capacity, it could be that while they are able to add 180,000 people, they may be even more poorly equipped than the people they already have. So in that sense, they're not necessarily adding much value here. They could surprise, it remains to be seen. They may be able to pull it off, but expectations are pretty low. Russian logistics are notoriously bad, and while they have improved over the course of the war, any big mobilization like this has proven to be a pretty heavy lift for them. And again, they'll have, that is to say, the Ukrainians will have about a year to prepare for this. So in the meantime, the Ukrainians themselves could do something to try to negate any advantage that the Russians are able to incur here. And keep in mind, too, that Western support is ramping up at the same time, and it's expected to reach potentially critical levels in 2025. Artillery is the main example I go back to. The combined efforts of Western countries supporting Ukraine, as far as artillery shells, is expected to reach Russian levels of production by 2025. And it'll probably supersede it eventually after that. So material support is going to continue to flow into Ukraine at an elevated level, and while that won't completely negate the manpower advantage that Russia has, especially if they're able to quickly bring in 180,000 well-equipped new troops to the field, it'll definitely help negate it. So we'll see how all of that kind of combines and defines the course of the conflict over the course of the end of this year, and then certainly in 2025.
There was a question in chat. Speaking of Italy, have you discussed in this format about the Italian mafioso La Camorra or associated history?
I don't think so. I'm not super familiar with the history of organized crime in Italy. I know there's a lot of connections with the United States. You know, a lot of the Italian immigrants that came over to the U.S. during the big immigration wave in the late 1800s, early 1900s came from southern Italy, and especially Sicily. And a lot of those guys had ties to organized crime. And a lot of the Italian organized crime groups in the northeastern United States, even today, have their roots in Sicily, in particular, and southern Italy more more generally. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know like specific groups, specific families, etc. That's kind of outside my wheelhouse. I know the Italian government has had a hell of a time trying to deal with them. I think there was like a big investigation back in the 80s that was designed to try to arrest a big mafioso, and they actually, that is to say, the mafia actually assassinated the lead prosecutor in that case.
Whoa.
And because it was so high profile, it was like a major political issue in Italy. So the Italian government ended up having to crack down pretty hard after that. But even so, results have been mixed. You know, the mafia is definitely still pretty thoroughly entrenched there. I think I remember reading that the Maloney government in power right now actually seriously considered seizing the children of people who were in the mafias. I don't know if anything came of that, but there was certainly like a big stink about it. You know, people were arguing about whether that was justifiable, since it was kind of an extreme move.
Why would you do that?
Well, the idea is that these mafias in Sicily are heavily dependent on family networks, and a lot of the times the family members will cultivate their children to take their place and lead the network later. So the idea of taking the children is to basically break the network. You know, instead of being raised to be professional criminals, they'll be taken to a foster home and be raised relatively more normally. So that could be a potentially significant blow against the mafias, although in reality, they'll probably just shift gears and find other people they trust to kind of fill the same role.
They just get child services to be like, hey, excuse me, sorry, this is a crime family that's raising this child, and we want to give them a chance in a non-crime family, so we're going to be moving them to a safer location.
I mean, that's actually what they were, you know, thinking about doing, and I think they actually did do it in a couple cases. The article I read about it actually had an interview with some of the children, I think, or maybe it was with children who had been taken 10, 20 years before in a similar operation, although that operation was like a limited example. In this case, the government was proposing to do it systematically. I don't think they ended up moving forward with that, but I do remember it being a topic of discussion. It's very difficult to unwind organized crime groups that are, you know, very well organized, and especially when they're defined by family ties, because family tends to be, well, blood is thicker than water, as the saying goes here in the United States. You know, people intrinsically trust family members much more so than they do friends, and certainly more than the government. So that can make it difficult to penetrate those kinds of networks.
Someone in chat was asking for an update on South Sudan.
I think we had a question like that a couple weeks ago. I don't have anything new. South Sudan, like a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, doesn't make the news much. So I generally don't hear much about them. So as far as I know, they're still in the same boat they were the last time I checked, which was low-level but endemic violence, especially along the border with Sudan. They've actually got a decent amount of oil in South Sudan. Their issue is that they don't really have enough political stability to take advantage of it fully. Yeah, before South Sudan became an independent country, it was part of Sudan proper. And Sudan, of course, was a major oil exporter, but most of the oil actually came from oil wells in South Sudan. So after South Sudan became independent, there were hopes that they would be able to take advantage of that oil revenue. But the issue, besides political instability, you know, and the internecine violence, was the fact that all of the oil infrastructure designed to pump the oil out to port where it could be exported ran through Sudan. And of course, the Sudanese government wasn't really interested in allowing that oil through unless they got very good royalties for it. So, it's resulted in a standoff to a degree and very little improvement in terms of oil revenue for the South Sudanese government. I imagine they'd be interested in trying to construct alternative oil infrastructure, pipelines specifically. But that's all very expensive. And again, given the political instability in the country, there's probably not going to be a lot of takers as far as contracting to have that stuff built. So that's resulted in them being more or less stuck with their status quo.
What are your thoughts on Trump being able to end the war between Russia and Ukraine?
I mean, it's possible he could if he brings enough pressure on Ukraine. The Ukrainian government may feel it has no choice but to negotiate some kind of short-term peace. But I think it would only be that. I don't think there's likely to be any long-term peace there that comes about as a result of a new Trump administration. I really, at this point, don't even think Trump actually cares about the conflict all that much. I think he just pretends to for political reasons. But if he actually got into power again, he would probably make some superficial effort at peace and then get bored and do something else. I don't think he's that invested. And Trump himself and his previous administration certainly were notoriously transactional, so it's entirely possible that how he deals with the conflict could just come down to a bidding war between the Ukrainian and Russian governments over who can get the Trump administration on their side. I don't know how that would pan out. Presumably Russia would be able to offer more resources, but that of course would come with political baggage, since everybody in the United States would shit on him, including nominal political allies, if he ended up getting bought out by Russia. So, Ukrainians may not be able to offer as much money or as many perks, if you like, but it would come with fewer strings and fewer risks attached, I imagine. So we'll see. I don't think it's inevitable, basically, and we've talked about this before, I don't think it's inevitable if Trump gets elected again that he's going to immediately just pull the plug on Ukraine. I think there would be resistance in Congress to that. I think there would be resistance in the general public to that. Certainly in Europe there would be. And I think ultimately that would probably sabotage any earnest effort on his part to actually try to end the conflict in the short term, certainly to end it in favor of Russia. But again, I don't think he would even really make an earnest attempt. I think it would largely be a symbolic attempt that would be, in terms of its content and substance, largely subject to whoever was able to win him over.
Yeah, so and flattery would definitely be a main avenue there.
Yeah, governments and foreign leaders figured out pretty quickly that that was the easiest way to deal with him. Just kind of pretend to give him what he wants, give him a superficial victory, and then walk away. That was the easiest way to do it. Didn't have to be a substantive agreement. So, Ukraine and Russia could well, for example, sign a temporary quote-unquote ceasefire that immediately gets broken, and then they just blame each other for it. So Trump could walk away saying he secured a ceasefire that ended the war, but that somebody broke it. And then he could just pretend to care and then not deal with the conflict any further. Mm-hmm. That would be classic behavior for him. Claim victory despite, no real change happening, and then moving on to the next thing. Have you been able to look at that map?
I don't know if I got it. Did you send it in Discord?
Did I send it to the right person? Let's see.
Yeah, I don't see one. Someone
Nope,
random.
I sent it to the wrong person.
Well, I'm glad that we figured it out.
I wonder who I sent it to. I can't tell.
Someone now got a personalized map from Agent Smith.
There you go.
On entities in the Middle East.
Okay. Now I sent it to the right person.
Okay. I see it.
Oh, I put it in the Agent Smith thing where the questions are. There we go.
Some of the people in chat can see it now. Okay, I'll show them after this game. The map of the Middle East that Aiden Smith made for us.
Let's see. We did have a question from Fuzzy Cord. Celebrity atheist Sam Harris has suggested that if Hamas and Hezbollah became pacifists, there'd be peace, whereas if Israel became pacifist, there'd be genocide. There'd be a genocide. However, Harris has a fairly heavy anti-Islamic bias. How would you evaluate such a statement? Is the situation really so asymmetric? So let's see. If Hamas and Hezbollah became pacifists, there'd be peace. No. If Israel became pacifist, there'd be a genocide. No, I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think any of that is true. I mean, the likelihood of either Israel or Hamas and Hezbollah becoming pacifist is extremely low. That's outlandish in the extreme at this point. You know, we've talked about this before, but just to kind of reiterate, both the Palestinians and the Israelis have their respective political spectrums. And those political spectrums, as far as the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, have a dovish side and a hawkish side. And what we've seen in both polities over the past 20 years is that the hawkish elements in both polities have come to the fore and dominated their respective political systems. You know, there are very few doves left in either Israel or Palestine. So extremely unlikely that there would be any pacifists, you know, regardless of context. But, you know, it's a hypothetical question, so, you know, let's look at that. So if Hamas and Hezbollah became pacifists, would there be peace? No, because there's still a hawkish element in Israel that doesn't think peace is viable, regardless of what groups like Hamas or Hezbollah or whomever adheres to. You know, they believe, specifically the settler parties in particular, believe that the West Bank and also Gaza belongs to them, belongs to the Jewish people, that God gave them that land and that it's theirs by right. And they're not going to quit trying to take that land just because radical elements in the Arab countries or among the Palestinians suddenly become pacifists. You know, they're going to continue to push for that land, and they'll find whatever reason they can think of, whatever excuse necessary to try to rationalize it. And they have enough political power at this point to kind of prevent the government from cracking down on it. You know, even the Netanyahu government under Likud was relatively reluctant to go like full settler colonialism. You know, that was controversial even within Likud. But the demographics of Israel increasingly shift in favor of the settlers and in favor of the fundamentalists in Israel that do believe they have like a God-given mission to settle the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, as they like to call it. You know, they even have their own name for it. So yeah, those groups are going to continue to push for this kind of expansionist greater Israel that they think is like their divine mission. And the fact that that's their objective means that they're going to constantly be in contention with the native Arab population of those territories. And so even if radical groups try to become pacifists in the Palestinian territories, the fact that the settlers are still going to be trying to expand is going to sabotage that. So invariably that friction would rekindle radicalism amongst the Palestinians. I know that most Israelis are not like expansionist, settler, colonialists and whatnot. You know, the political spectrum is bigger than just Likud and then settlers. You know, they have their groups. But in general, the public sentiment in Israel is extremely skeptical of the Palestinians and the prospects for peace. And that makes any effort to give what is perceived as concessions very difficult. And, you know, make no mistake, any effort to stop the expansion of settlements is going to be seen as as a concession, rather. That's going to be seen as a concession. You know, so the logic is, so long as we have the settlements and they're expanding, we have leverage, and we should not give up that leverage unless we get something really good in return. And I don't think there's anything the Palestinians could deliver that would really be good enough for them. There's no scenario where the Palestinians like disarm and become full pacifists. That's not going to be enough. You know, there's just too much institutionalized paranoia in the political culture in Israel to ever make that feasible. And again, you know, the most expansionist elements in the body politic are the ones that are demographically growing the fastest. So their political power is growing over time. So even if there were a shift away in terms of broader public sentiment from settler colonialism, from a hawkish approach to the issue presented by the Palestinians. The demographics mean that there's going to be an ingrained political preference amongst a broader and broader part of the voting body politic for hawkish expansionism. So I don't think, there's any really hope I don't think there's much hope there, basically. I think hawkishness and expansionism is baked in, and that's going to be a permanent impediment to any kind of real peace between Israelis and Palestinians going forward in the long term. As far as Israelis becoming pacifist and that invariably leading to genocide, that's obviously false. Israel has nuclear weapons. Even if they declare full pacifism, I don't think that means that if they came under attack again, they would just roll over and die. That's not how pacifism really works. So, in all likelihood, if Israel did become pacifist and somebody did try to commit genocide, then the nukes come out, and then it's settled. So the idea that Israel is in perpetual danger of being obliterated by some genocidal enemy, it's just false. Like, that's a false narrative. You can't seriously threaten a country's integrity when that country has nuclear weapons, and Israel does. They pretend not to, but everybody knows they does. It's like an open secret.
How many do they have compared to the other countries who have some?
About 50, last I checked. Although it's impossible to verify, because of course they're very secretive about the program. So we don't know exactly how many they have, but the estimate that I read was about 50. So that's not a lot, and they're probably not like really high yield nuclear weapons. I don't think Israel has like a Tsar Bomba or something. But they live in a small neighborhood with countries with relatively small populations, so it's not like they need a whole lot. Just a couple relatively small yield nuclear weapons would probably be enough to wipe out most of Palestine, for example, if they wanted to do that. So that's ample for deterrence. There's not going to be another Holocaust.
Yeah, I know that Sam Harris has been really vocal about the tenets of a lot of religious faiths, and for the era that we're in, at least for Western media, we've had Islamic radicals doing a lot of the terrorism, more so than Buddhist or Christian radicals. So the lens of criticism is going to lean pretty heavy. So he definitely sees a lot of villain behavior over there that he's outspoken about. But he's in the same category as many other intellectuals, where his domain is actually neuroscience. So if he's talking about neuroscience and pathways of the brain and stuff, he's probably super smart. But if he's talking about like random shit that's happening in world events, he probably knows less about that because it's not his wheelhouse. But if you're a person, you're allowed to have opinions. So just be careful as you're listening to people's opinions. I'm not saying Sam Harris is a bad person or whatever, but it's outside his wheelhouse, from what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of people tend to talk outside their area of expertise. Not that I would know anything about that.
I like Sam Harris third most of the four horsemen of New Atheism. You've got Richard Dawkins. He's just too rude, so he's probably my least favorite. Daniel Dennett is like atheist Santa Claus. He's really funny, really nice philosophical guy. Christopher Hitchens is probably one of the wittiest people to ever exist, and he's really brutal with how he owns people in arguments, so he's probably my favorite, but he's passed on. And then, probably Sam Harris, third favorite.
I think Hitchens had a brother, didn't he?
Maybe? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think he, I've seen him do some debates. He's kind of more of a crank, though. Not so much a master debater.
What does a crank mean?
Oh, just like a fringe person who believes in fringe political beliefs, that kind of thing. Alternative views, if you like.
I see.
Let's see, I think that's all we had for questions.
Cool.
Oh, wait, New Zealand. Have you looked into New Zealand domestic current situation with significant tensions between indigenous Maori? Not Maori, but Maori. I got shit on for pronouncing it wrong a couple years ago. So I've been trying to do it right. I think it is Maori. Okay, tensions between indigenous Maori with a new queen and right-wing federal government. There's even talk that the almost 200-year-old treaty between the British Crown and the Maori nations is about to be torn up. Yeah, so this is another example of a obscure part of the world that doesn't make my news feed much, so I hadn't heard about this. This is the first time. I know there's been tensions between the indigenous community in New Zealand and the white community, basically the majority of the population. That's not new. A very similar situation in Australia in that regard. But I also note that a lot of these flare-ups, as far as like tensions between Aborigines and the majority population, specifically in Australia and New Zealand, never really tend to go anywhere. Like if the treaty in question was actually torn up and tensions escalate, like what happens? Anything? Because the indigenous community is relatively weak. It's not well off. It tends to be marginalized. They don't have a lot of money to work with. They don't control like broad swaths of the economy or the public sector. So they don't have a lot of tools there to work with that they can bring to bear. I mean, there could be violence, but I mean, if it came to that, I suspect the state would be able to handle it pretty readily. Yeah, I would have to defer to somebody who lives there, because again, without having read more about it, I can't comment too much. I'm relatively familiar with the broader tension, but I also don't think there's enough, how should I say, I don't think there's enough symmetry between the two groups in question for there to be real fireworks there. Like one group is just so much more powerful than the other that there's not really any real threat that can emerge there. Yeah, New Caledonia is actually a good example of what I'm talking about. We talked about the protests there a couple weeks ago. The population in New Caledonia is actually really even. It's like roughly 50-50 between ethnically French people and then ethnically indigenous people. For those maybe not familiar with New Caledonia, it's an island that's roughly like 100, 200 miles east of Australia, and it's a French territory. So it is actually part of France, like Hawaii is part of the United States. But the indigenous population is not very happy about the changes in the demographics of the island. They kind of feel like they're being invaded, colonized, et cetera. It's an old story if you're familiar with, colonialism and the issues of settlement of foreign territories. It's a familiar story. It's played out exactly the same there as everywhere else. But because the demographics are way less lopsided than in Australia or in New Zealand, there's been much more organization by the indigenous peoples on the island, and they've been much more vociferous about voicing their opposition to further influx of foreign population, as well as to opposition to the status quo as far as how the territory is governed, because right now it's governed more from France than it is by local authorities, and they would prefer that to change. And there's a lot of people there in the indigenous community that would prefer outright independence from France. As I recall, they've had a couple independence referendum, but they've all failed. But of course, the issue is that most of the people voting to stay with the status quo as part of France are themselves French citizens who moved there and are not indigenous. If you just look at the votes of the indigenous people, most of them vote for independence, but they're not demographically large enough to swing the referendum that way, and so the result is this awkward, uncomfortable limbo for everybody, where you have like a very restive, upset indigenous population chafing against a roughly demographically evenly sized group of people that prefer to stay part of France, but otherwise but don't have a lot of attachments to the indigenous native culture. So the Maori don't really have the benefit of still being like 50% of the population. They're more like 10, maybe. Mm-hmm. I used to read that it was 40%, and for a long time I thought that was true, and then I read more into that statistic. I think I even talked about it on stream, and then somebody was like, I don't think that's true. So then I looked it up. So the 40% is like people with some Maori heritage. So like they're 1/16th Maori or something like that. But if you just look at people who are like purely ethnically Maori, in so much as that's a thing, pretty small part of the population. It's more like 10-15% or something like that. If you look at Australia, the number of Aborigines as a percentage of the population is even smaller. So it's definitely not equivalent to like New Caledonia in that sense. They just don't have nearly the numbers to really pose the kind of challenge that the New Caledonians do.
A chat from Australia is saying Aborigines is usually something they try to avoid saying now. It's like mildly disrespectful, not like a slur or anything, but Indigenous peoples is preferred, or Aboriginal Australians.
Aboriginal, okay.
Yeah. Makes sense.
No.
We have our awesome map up now.
Okay.
So we have green, yellow, blue, and purple. Just trying to think about what could be what. Green is Turkey and a little bit of some other stuff which might also still be Turkey. Israel is in blue, and so is Israel's neighbor across the border. Jordan, okay. And then there's some more blue up from that across the way to the east and north. And then there's a blue dot in the middle of, what is this, Iran? Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah, that's more of an abstraction than actual territory. It's a little hard to do Iraq because relatively few of the players actually control specific tracts of territory. But I did want to represent American influence there somehow, so I added the blue circle.
Gotcha. So purple has Egypt, Saudi Arabia, a lot of Sudan, Libya, and then there's some green in Libya as well.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
So basically there's two governments in Libya that pretend that they're the official government. There's one in the east, centered in the city of Benghazi, that's led by a warlord named Haftar. And then there's a government in the west that is nominally centered in Tripoli, but actually has its power center in the city of Misrata. And they're led by a coalition of groups that fought as rebels against Gaddafi back when the revolution happened during the Arab Spring. Their leadership is a little more amorphous. So both of these governments have been fighting each other basically since the Arab Spring. The intensity of the fighting kind of waxes and wanes with time. In the case of the Benghazi government, they receive support from the United Arab Emirates, as well as from, to a lesser degree, the Saudis, and mostly from the Egyptians. The government in Tripoli receives support from the Turkish government, principally. There was actually a couple years ago a big offensive by the Benghazi government to try to take complete control of Libya. And they made a lot of progress, but ultimately what happened is that the Turks de facto intervened. They didn't intervene with their own troops, but they did send a bunch of drones. And that was enough to turn the tide of battle. And since then, things have been pretty stabilized. I would add here that it's not really true that the Benghazi government controls like 90% of Libya. But most of the groups that control the western parts of Libya that are colored purple here are relatively more aligned with the Benghazi government. But it's more of a loose association rather than like outright hierarchical control.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the Tripoli government and the territory they control directly is basically a proxy for the Turkish government. That's their primary benefactor. And then the parts controlled directly by the Benghazi governments are operating more with the support of the Egyptians. Yeah, I colored both Egypt and Saudi Arabia purple here because while they're not really formally allied, they do have a lot of common interests, and they have been working together more over the past 10 years. Obviously, the Arab Spring was a major threat to both of them. You know, whether you're a major pan-Arab nationalist country like Egypt or a Gulf monarchy like Saudi Arabia, the Arab Spring and its wave of democratization posed a existential threat to both regimes. And so, especially after Egypt encountered a lot of economic trouble, partly from fallout from the Arab Spring and also from other stuff happening around the same time, the Saudis kind of stepped in with financial support to help prop up the Egyptian government, to prevent it from falling and to shore up the institutionalist actors there, specifically the military, so that they could continue to keep out Islamist forces, to keep Islamist forces from coming to power there, rather. So since then, they've kind of had this mutual appreciation society. And, again, nothing formal really, but Saudi Arabia sends money, and Egypt kind of helps prevent Islamists from coming power in their corner of the Middle East. So beneficial arrangement there, and they generally don't have areas of the Middle East where they're directly in conflict. So they kind of represent a de facto single bloc at this point.
And then part of Sudan is in that block as well, but then this is South Sudan here.
Yeah, so the United Arab Emirates are pretty tightly aligned with the Saudis on most issues, especially vis-a-vis Iran, but the Emiratis also kind of pursue their own interests in the region as well. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in Sudan, they had a pre-existing relationship with the Rapid Support Forces, which are basically the successors to the Janjaweed militia that had been committing genocide in Darfur back in the early aughts, 20-some years ago. And that relationship came out of the Yemeni civil war, where the Emiratis recruited Janjaweed from Darfur to help fight for the official UN-recognized government in South Sudan that was fighting against the Houthis. So basically, the Janjaweed/RSF were Emirati mercenaries fighting in Yemen. And the Emiratis wanted to cultivate and maintain that relationship, just in case they needed them elsewhere. And so when the RSF decided to go to war with the Sudanese army to fight for control of Sudan, the Emiratis actually sent them some support, partly as a reward for previous service and partly also just to maintain positive relations and possibly, on the upside, to have a good relationship with what could be the future government of Sudan. Now, the Sudanese army has been receiving a lot of support from the Egyptian government because the RSF are kind of adjacent to Islamists. They're not really Islamists themselves, but they had ties to the previous Islamist government of Sudan that had been brought down a couple years ago by mass protests, as well as by the army defecting against them. And the Egyptian government doesn't really like that. They would prefer to have the army in control rather than any kind of Democrats or Islamists. So the result is that they don't trust the RSF, don't want them in power, and in turn, the Egyptians find themselves in a kind of proxy war with the Emirati government. The extent of that support is kind of debatable. It's not entirely clear, but they are definitely supporting both sides to varying degrees. So I don't think either government really thinks of it as a proxy war against each other. I don't think they really have enough tension between them inherently, but there is disagreement as far as, which faction they support in the Sudanese civil war. And so they just kind of happen to find themselves on opposite sides. I would point out, too, that the Emiratis also have a sphere of influence in southern Sudan, around the city of Aden. They actually support the Southern Transition Council, which is a local militia that was founded in and around Aden that wants to fight the Houthis. They don't want to, be under their control, but they also would prefer if South Yemen, and specifically Aden, were broken off from the rest of Yemen and made independent again. It actually used to be independent for some decades after they were granted independence by the British, and it wasn't until the 1990s that South Yemen was integrated into North Yemen to form the Yemen we all know and love today. But it didn't take very long after unification for people in the South to kind of chafe under the new unified government. They didn't really get along with the political elites that formed in the wake of the unification, and so they pretty quickly started lobbying to try to break South Yemen off again. And they didn't have much luck, obviously, but since the civil war started, they've been much more active in, forming their own groups, specifically the Southern Transition Council, and pushing harder for independence for South Yemen. And they do that with the backing of the Emiratis. That's sort of their proxy in the conflict.
The official UN-recognized government is more of the Saudi proxy. The Saudis maintain closer ties with them. And there actually have been some incidents where the official government has actually fought against the Southern Transition Council, which has resulted in some Saudi pressure on the Emiratis to try to rein in their allies. So for the most part, the Emiratis are aligned with the Saudis, but there are specific regions where they're kind of on different sides.
Mm-hmm. Is the blue piece Djibouti?
Yeah, in the Horn of Africa, yeah, that would be Djibouti. Yeah, France maintains pretty strong influence there. They still have a pretty large military deployment there. The elites in Djibouti speak French. They still got those elite cultural ties. And otherwise, it's still pretty heavily influenced by France. So yeah, blue is basically a representation of Western influence in the region. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Djibouti, France, and to a lesser degree, the United States. In the case of Jordan, it's more the UK. All of the royal family members in Jordan, specifically the male royal family members, all go and are trained at Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of West Point. It's a big military academy. They train a lot of the officers that go on to serve in the British military. And the Hashemite dynasty, which is the royal family that controls Jordan, was itself installed into power in Jordan by the British in the wake of World War I. So they have lots of ties there. And the Jordanian government, in turn, has cultivated relations with the United States, which basically took up what had been previously a British role in the Middle East of guaranteeing security for the region. So the British probably have more direct influence over the actual royal family, but in terms of overall strategic relations, the Jordanian relationship with the United States is probably more important at this point. And of course, Israel's diplomatic alignment is well established by this point. Obviously, They side pretty heavily with the United States and coordinate closely with Washington to varying degrees. I don't know if you can see it, but there's also a little bit of blue just across the border from Jordan into Syria. Mm-hmm. So there's actually an air base that was created there at a town called Al-Tanf that was created initially by rebels that had been trained by both the United States and the Saudis, as well as probably the Jordanians. And those rebel groups have maintained control over that border area ever since. And then further up into northeastern Syria, that chunk of blue there is the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the main Kurdish group in the northeast, which is, of course, allied with the United States. The U.S. fought with them when the Islamic State spread in eastern Syria and western Iraq. And so there's kind of a de facto alliance there between Washington and the Kurds in the region. And the United States maintains, I think, an air base there, as well as a deployment of special forces to try to act as a deterrent against potential Turkish or Damascus aggression, and also to try to continue operations against the Islamic State and whatever residual units they have left operating there.
There's a couple chunks of green in Syria as well.
Yeah, those are the areas that are occupied by rebels that are aligned with and supported by the Turkish government. So northwestern Syria is their main area of operations. Rebels were the most successful there, and unsurprisingly, that's the area that's closest to the Turkish border, certainly the most populated parts of the Turkish border. And so that's probably one of the only areas that the rebels managed to take over the course of the civil war that they've managed to hold on to. They've not done so on their own. The Turkish army actually was eventually deployed into Idlib province, the region that I'm talking about here, and they act as deterrents against any significant effort by the Syrian government to try to retake the territory. Yeah, the area further east that's green is actually an area of Kurdish territory that was taken by the Turkish army in conjunction with Turkish-aligned rebels back during the Trump administration, when Trump famously had a phone call with the president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, and Erdogan apparently convinced Trump to pull out of eastern Syria and to start with that particular area of the border. And so U.S. troops dutifully withdrew and were subsequently followed by Turkish and Turkish-supported units, which then went out and assassinated a bunch of Kurdish leaders that had been working with the United States. It was one of the low points of the Trump administration's foreign policy, in my perception.
Here's what you do. You just get him on the phone, tell him he's great, tell him he's so great, tell him he's really great. Then what you tell him to do is to pull the troops out of this area so we can take it. But then after you do that, tell him he's great 3 more times. He will do exactly what you tell him.
Well, it worked. And the Turks have managed to occupy the territory ever since.
And it looks like there's some green dipping into Iraq as well.
Yeah, so the northernmost provinces of Iraq are all Kurdish. I think there's 3 of them. And they're relatively small geographically, but they contain most of the Kurdish population of Iraq. And the way the Iraqi constitution is written, those provinces are nominally autonomous. Technically, they're part of a autonomous government called the Kurdish Regional Government, which is a little bit separate from the rest of Iraq. And the Turkish government doesn't occupy those territories, doesn't have troops there, but the Turkish government has gone out of its way to cultivate relations with the Kurdish governments in the region. You know, there's a lot of Turkish economic influence. They used to have a lot of oil deals with Kurdish governments in the area before the Iraqi government cracked down on that. They basically monopolized negotiation of Iraqi oil deals, whether the oil was made in Kurdish areas or not. But even still, with that change, Turkey retains a lot of influence there and coordinates and cooperates with Kurdish political elites in the region, usually against elements of the PKK, which is the main Kurdish separatist group that operates in eastern Turkey. Kurdish groups in northeastern Syria are actually pretty closely aligned with the PKK. The Turks would argue that they're effectively controlled by the PKK. So the Turks don't like them. They don't get along. But the Kurdish groups operating in northern Iraq are not associated or affiliated with the PKK. They actually are descendants of political lineages that go back to the early 1990s, if not earlier, when Kurdish groups were trying to rise up against the Iraqi government, generally with support from the United States. So those political lineages, and you know they are lineages. The 2 major Kurdish political parties in Kurdish Iraq are both basically run by family dynasties, and both of those groups had maintained pretty good relations, but over the past 5 years, those relations have broken down, and now they're more or less an open conflict. Not generally violent conflict, but they do compete pretty hard for control of different polities in Kurdish Iraq. And at this point, they've actually become proxies themselves. There's one group that's backed more by the Turks, and there's another group that's backed more by the Iranians. I think the Turkish group is the one that holds most of the power in Kurdish Iraq right now, in the Kurdish regional government. But I think the Iranian group also retains significant influence.
What's this little blue piece at the bottom of Iraq?
That's Kuwait.
Kuwait. So Western influence?
Yeah, Kuwait has a agreement with the United States in which the United States guarantees their security. And, you know, when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq back in 91, it was mostly the United States that ended up liberating them. So Kuwait's relationship with the United States is much more positive than other countries in the region. And correspondingly, American influence in particular is very strong there. You know, when the United States invaded Iraq, for example, in 2003, it actually did it almost entirely from Kuwait.
That makes sense. Gives a landing point for doing stuff. What's the green piece here?
Southeast of Kuwait?
Yeah.
That's Qatar.
Qatar, okay.
Yeah, so the Qatari royal family is on bad terms with the Saudi royal family and has been for a long time. Relations over the past couple years have improved significantly. You know, it wasn't even all that long ago that the Saudis basically cut off the land border and prevented any and all movement of people or goods across it because they wanted to pressure the Qatari government into towing the Saudi line in regional affairs, which of course the Qatari government did not want to do. Keep in mind, the tension between them is not really strategic so much as it is personal. The Saudi royal family actually bankrolled a coup attempt in Qatar in the 1990s, which ended up failing. But the Qatari royal family never really forgave them for it. So there's considerable enmity between the 2 families as a result. And correspondingly, they do not coordinate or cooperate with each other much in regional strategic affairs. The Saudis see the Iranians as an existential threat, and by and large try to prevent Islamists from taking power or even really participating politically in regional affairs as much as possible. The Qatari perspective, by contrast, is that the Iranians can be negotiated with. Still a threat. They don't really trust them either, but they think they can be negotiated with, and they have a much more comfortable relationship with political Islam in the Middle East than the Saudis do. Famously, Al Jazeera, the news channel, was created in Qatar and is bankrolled and supported by the Qatari royal family. And they, of course, give voice to a lot of political dissidents in the region, much to the eternal chagrin of the Saudi royal family, which absolutely fucking hates that. And they've continually pressured the Qatari government in one form or another to either close down Al Jazeera or at least to significantly rein in its operations and to stop acting as a voice for dissidents around the region. The Qataris have refused to do that, and they continue to give voice to various socially conservative elements, generally Islamist in nature, in the region, and are very critical of the status quo in general. You might wonder why a royal family would give voice to dissidents in a region dominated by monarchies. And, the reason they do that is because the royal family itself tries to cultivate relationships with those dissident actors in order to kind of mitigate the threat to themselves. So the reason I have them as green is because they actually have a relationship with the Turkish government, especially back during the Syrian civil war when it was at its height. The Turkish operations in Syria were partly, maybe even largely, financed by Qatari oil money. The Qataris themselves believed that the Syrian government needed to go, and they thought that given that the government, as they saw it at the time, was on the way out, that intervening and helping the Turks in their operations there would be a good way to establish a foothold in Syria and maybe even a sphere of influence there. So Turco-Qatari operations kind of go hand in hand in the region. They very rarely conflict with each other. They have common cause.
Is this the UAE that's next to it that's kind of a light purple?
Yeah, those are the Emiratis.
Okay. And then there's this country that's not colored, it's in white.
Oman. Yeah, they're basically neutral in regional affairs. They mind their own business and try to stay out of all the drama. It's a policy that served them very well. When was the last time you heard of Oman in the news?
That's true, I haven't. And then this is Yemen down here, that's 3 different colors?
Yeah, so the Houthis are nominally supported by the Iranians. They don't really have that much in common other than the common enemy in the form of the Saudis. But that's been enough to get that was enough to get the Saudis involved in the conflict themselves. They believed preemptively that the Houthis would end up becoming an Iranian proxy, and that was enough for them to jump into the conflict. So the Saudis backed the official UN-recognized government, led by, I think his name was Hadi at the time. And then the Iranians, in turn, saw the opportunity to kind of needle the Saudi rival by supporting the Houthis. And so, in turn, the Houthis have become a de facto Iranian proxy.
And what's the gray spot between the two of them?
Oh, the light purple? Yeah, that's Emirati influence. That's where the Southern Transitional Council is, roughly speaking.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you look up near Turkey, you can see the country to the east of Turkey, green, is Azerbaijan. That's not really a country that is under Turkish tutelage or anything, but the Turks do have more influence there than anybody else at this point. The Azerbaijanis are kind of a player in their own right. They export a lot of energy, so they have a lot of money to work with. But in general, they tend to focus more on staying insular and also getting their land back from the Armenians. I think we've talked before about the land dispute there between those two. But one of the major backers of the Azerbaijani operation against the occupied territories was the Turks. They gave them and sold them a lot of weapons. They sold them without any strings attached. So when the war started between the Azerbaijan government and the Armenian government, while the rest of the world was saying that they should hold off and engage in peace talks, the Turkish government was kind of egging them on and helping them out. So the Turkish government and the Azerbaijani government have a pretty close relationship. They're on very friendly terms, which is why I had Azerbaijan as green here.
Makes sense.
And then if you look south of Turkey, to the west of Syria, you can see an island there that's partly green. So that's Cyprus. Back in the 1970s, Turkey invaded the northern part of Cyprus because that's where the ethnic Turkish population on Cyprus lived. There was a lot of political discord and tension in Cypriot politics over the course of the 60s and 70s that emerged because of growing Greek nationalism on the island. The two main ethnicities on the island are Greek and Turkish. So the Turkish government didn't like all of the Greek nationalism on Cyprus, and they thought that the Turkish population was being abused by the Greek government, and so eventually they just intervened directly in the mid-1970s. Occupied northern Cyprus, spun it off into a nominally independent government that isn't really independent. It's basically just controlled by the Turkish government. But they've been trying to maintain the fiction that it's an independent state ever since. Nobody else recognizes them, and certainly the official Cypriot government in southern Cyprus really hates the fact that half their country is occupied and has lobbied endlessly to try to end that. But the talks that have occurred intermittently over the past 50-some years have gone pretty much nowhere. And so the result is a stalemate where half the island is occupied by the Turks.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What's this little purple spot? Is this in Lebanon?
Oh, yeah, Lebanon. So, southern Lebanon is more Hezbollah's power base. That's very much a power base for Iran by extension as well, in so much as Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Mm-hmm. But then northern Lebanon is kind of more of a mixed bag. The Sunni Muslim groups there kind of align more with the Saudis. There was a guy named Hariri. His father had been a major politician for decades in Lebanon. I think eventually he was assassinated by the Syrians. But his son ended up becoming de facto leader of the Sunni Muslim parties. And he received support and money from the Saudi government to the point where he actually was kind of kidnapped at one point. I remember reading about that. There were not a lot of details that came out, but basically he went on a trip to Saudi Arabia, and then supposedly they were refusing to let him leave. It was something weird like that. But yeah, the other political groups besides Hezbollah in Lebanon tend to align more with the Sunni Muslim powers in the region. They're also subject to a fair amount of Western influence, since there's a lot of aid that comes into the country from Western sources. But I went with purple in this case because I think the Saudis, in particular, are probably the stronger source of influence in northern Lebanon.
So you've got Turkish primarily influence is green, Saudi influence primarily is purple, and then you've got yellow is Iran is probably the biggest actor of those.
Yeah. And then blue would be Western, light purple, Emirati.
Yeah. Cool. This really breaks down the way the power is split. It's interesting that the smaller countries usually find a larger buddy to look out for them. Makes sense.
Yeah, you kind of have to.
Mm-hmm.
Not much choice in a region that violent.
It's interesting hearing about fighting Christians because of how uniform a lot of Western stuff has been. I'm talking about after the Protestant Reformation, because obviously that was our time when we were speaking, we historically Christian, very violent toward other types of Christians. But these sorts of conflicts where it's Christians and Muslims fighting each other, it happens in a lot of places in the world, but not really in the West. So I didn't know that happened in Lebanon. Pretty interesting. You've got Christian minorities in a lot of these countries that mentally I just think of them as Muslim countries. I don't really think about, but every country that has a predominant belief system also has the other belief system represented as some population amount.
Yeah, there's not really many Christians left, though. They've been kind of systematically pushed out over the course of all the violent conflicts that have happened over the past 50-some years.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a minority group that's been shrinking dramatically over time. I think Egypt in particular is a good example of that. Because Egypt used to be all Christian, right, until the Islamic invasions happened way back when. But I think even 50 years ago, they were maybe as much as 20% of the population. Mm-hmm. Now it's down more to around 10. And I think that's the largest Christian minority in the Arab world at this point. I don't think any other Christian group in any other Arab country comes anywhere close to 10%. I think mostly it's around 1 to 5% at this point. Mm-hmm. With the obvious exception of, Lebanon, where there's a lot more.
Mm-hmm. And then there's one dot here in Somalia. It's purple.
Yeah, I just threw that in to represent the Egyptians, kind of aligning with the Somali government and sending troops there. I think we talked about that last week with regard to Egyptian tension with Ethiopia over the Grand Renaissance Dam.
Well, cool. Thank you for doing a quick Middle Eastern map for us.
Oh, no problem.
I did not know most of this.
Hopefully I didn't miss too much.
Looks good to me. If you missed anything up, please let us know. There were a couple other questions, but we're about out of time for this segment, so if you want to poke us next week, we can hit those. There was one quick one, maybe you heard about it. There were 25 laws passed that messed up China or something. Something else, propaganda. What is this? 25 anti-China laws. And then something. This is U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I'd heard about them considering some laws. I hadn't heard about them actually passing them.
The House of Reps approved it, looks like it says.
Oh, okay. So it hasn't actually passed the Senate yet. Okay. Yeah, I've been following it too closely, mostly because a lot of the China consensus is more done for theatrics than substance. I haven't really seen any real actual strategizing happening vis-a-vis competition with China in Washington. So I'll look into the 25 laws. I'll try to get caught up on that. But I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to annoy me more than anything else. It's going to be a lot of dumb shit, would be my guess. The only thing of substance that's happened with regard to Sino-American competition in the past couple weeks was the Biden administration announcing that they're going to try to pass a rule that's going to ban cars in the United States from having networked electronics from China in them. Because there's a lot of what do you call it? The Internet of Things, which is a stupid name, but the Internet of Things extends to cars too. They have a lot of equipment that can connect them to the internet. And the concern is that if that equipment is Chinese, then the Chinese government could somehow infiltrate it and potentially set it up so that they could remotely control cars and maybe cause havoc on American roads. So the Biden administration wants to try to prevent that from happening by just banning the possibility entirely. Automakers were saying that they could do it, but it's going to be very disruptive because they're going to have to completely reorient their supply chain. There have been more and more cars made with that kind of technology in them, and almost all of the technology was Chinese in origin. So this is going to be a big change for the car makers, but they say that they can handle it. It's just going to take a while. But yeah, that's the only substantive move, and that's not even all that substantive, really, in my mind. It makes sense, it's logical, but it's not going to really change the overall arc of the competition, right? It's not going to mitigate Chinese influence in Southeast Asia or anything like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, and part of the checks and balances of U.S. government that we're mentioning here is the Congress is split into the House of Representatives and the Senate. And to pass things, you need to have all the branches agree to it. So sometimes you'll have something that is relatively more ambitious that passes in one house but not both. But people can get hyped up about the possibility of things passing. One of the things you talked about, it was idiot proofing, just making sure that you don't get any silly ideas that people can run away with in a small number of people that isn't actually good for the whole. Very important part of good governance, the institutions that prevent the primates from being too silly.
Very useful.
Yeah.
If the primates in question actually operate the machinery of government correctly, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
No guarantee of that.
Well, awesome. Thank you, Agent Smith, for your time and breaking these things down for us. Thank you, chat, for your lovely questions. And thank you again for the map, too. That's hecking amazing. We will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.